I am Soren Shah, a senior program manager in the big data team in Microsoft. And today I'm going to talk about the new enterprise-grade capabilities which we are adding to HD Insight, a managed Hadoop and Spark offering on Azure cloud. So here are the session objectives for today. I'll go over a brief overview of what HD Insight is, and I'll talk about how you can configure HD Insight to have perimeter security. Then I'll go over how you can integrate HD Insight with your Azure Active Directory. You can set up multi-user authentication and how you will have multi-user authorization using Apache Ranger. And finally, I'm going to go over encryption of data at rest with HD Insight. And when I go over all of these, I'm going to go over a lot of demos, so understanding the concepts will be easier. In fact, more than half of my presentation is going to be demos. And I hope to send you back with just one key takeaway, that HD Insight is the solution that you would need if you want enterprise-grade capabilities for Hadoop on cloud. Okay. So what is HD Insight? And before I dive deep, I want to just get a quick poll of how many of you use Hadoop today? Most of you, right? And how many of you have used HD Insight? Oh, wow, a few of you. Thank you. I would connect with you to get some feedback. And the last question, how many of you have felt a need to have multi-user authentication for Hadoop clusters, right? And this presentation is exactly going to be that one. And if you want, I can connect with you after to see how HD Insight will help you guys. Okay. So for those of you who don't know what HD Insight is, it is a managed Hadoop and Spark offering on Azure cloud. You can go to Azure portal today, and you can just with push of a few buttons, you can stand up a highly available fault-tolerant Hadoop cluster running on cloud within just a few minutes. And not only that, you can configure your cluster however you want and save the settings so that next time when you spin up the cluster, it will be exactly same as before. So many people underestimate this functionality. But let me tell you, this is really, really powerful. And that's because you can destroy your cluster when you don't need it. And you pay only for the hours your cluster is up and running. Like our studies and independent research studies, they have shown and proven that running your Hadoop cluster with HD Insight on cloud is a fraction of the total cost of ownership, is just a fraction of what you will spend on-premises. Let me give a very quick demo, just a 2-minute demo of how easy it is to create an HD Insight cluster on cloud. So can you guys see the screen well? Okay. So here I have, Azure portal. I go to New, Intelligence plus Analytics, and then I'll HD Insight, and I'm landed on this screen. There are just 2 steps required to create this Hadoop cluster on the cloud. In the first step, you enter the cluster name, which is demo v7, your subscription, what type of cluster you want. And HD Insight supports multiple different types of clusters, like Hadoop, HBase, Storm, Spark, or Interactive Hive, which is a new one, and Kafka. Then you specify your admin credentials. And these admin credentials you will use to log on to the cluster and manage your cluster. You can also use these credentials to run the jobs on the cluster via a lot of tools that we support, and even via the dashboard itself. And I'll go over some demos on that. And the location where you want to create the cluster. So that's it for the first step. And in the second step, you specify the storage account that you want with your cluster. Now in the storage, HD Insight supports 2 different types of storage accounts. The first one is Windows Azure Storage, or WASB, and Azure Data Lake Storage, or ADLS. Now here I'm using a WASB account, or Windows Azure Storage. There's an optional data lake storage as well, which I'm not using in this cluster. And that's all you need to do. So on the summary page, I can just hit create, and in less than 10 minutes, your cluster will be up and running on the cloud. I won't create the cluster right now, but I've already created one, which is this one. And the overview page looks like this. So there is a button called Cluster Dashboard. I can hit the Cluster Dashboard button. And when I click this, I'll be taken to a login page. On the login page, I can enter the admin credentials, which I use to create the cluster. And when I log in, I'll be taken to Ambari dashboard. Now, Ambari is an open source by Hortonworks. And our cluster bits also we get from Hortonworks, which we deploy on Azure. When I'm logged on to Ambari, on the left-hand side, I see all the services which are running on the cluster. The HDFS, MapReduce, Yarn, These, and all of these. In the middle, I see all the monitoring tools and the widgets which I can use to monitor my cluster. And there are a lot of other options that I have, is adding some services or restarting the services or stopping the services if something is wrong. I can go to the views, and Hive view and These view are the two views on this cluster. I can go to, say, Hive view, for example, and I can run some Hive jobs just straight out of the box. Now, this is a plain just cluster which I just stood up, so it doesn't have any data or anything, but it has a default database, and it has a Hive sample table which we have already created. And I can very easily just run a job and get the data from the Hive sample database. Okay. So we saw how easy it is to create an HD Insight cluster today. And HD Insight is a fairly new product, so it's about 3-year-old product. As the open source system kept evolving, we kept evolving HD Insight as well. We started with just Hive and Hadoop and MapReduce jobs. Then we added HBase and Storm and Kafka and the new thing, Spark. And now we are adding Hive LLAP as well. There was a session just before this on that one. But there is one more trend that's going on in the open source system, and that's move to enterprise readiness. This is a very subtle trend, but that's happening today. A research done by the TDWI group shows that the adoption of Hadoop clusters in enterprises is accelerating. 89% of the users whom they interviewed consider Hadoop as an opportunity for business and technology innovation. And not only TDWI group, but Forrester Group also recently published a report which predicts that Hadoop in enterprises will grow by 33% in the next 5 years. So what all this is saying is that Hadoop is no longer a buzzword. People are creating real production workloads on Hadoop. And the ownership of Hadoop systems, or the clusters, is shifting from application teams to central IT. Now, I've started seeing this trend in Microsoft. Have you guys seen this in your organizations as well? Right? So as the open source system evolved, we thought of evolving HD Insight as well to move to enterprise readiness. And the presentation, the rest of the presentation is going to be exactly those features which we are adding to move to enterprise readiness. But before I start, let me introduce you to Sameer. Sameer is a director of IT in one of the large food industry enterprises. Sameer's company sells do-it-yourself lunch boxes to their customers in Chicago. And Sameer's company gathers a lot of information about their customers and they enter it in their Hadoop clusters or HT Insight clusters. Some of it is very obvious, such as their customer name, cell phone, email, address, credit card, and so on, right? The product management team in Sameer's company gathers some information about what are their customers thinking about their products, like their customer reviews or tweets or ratings. And they also gather some information about what are the product demand. So which products are being ordered, how many of them are ordered, what discounts are we providing, what is the daily revenue, and many information. And lastly, the logistics team in Sameer's company gathers some information such as how much time is it taking to deliver the products, what is the cost of transportation, and which route are we taking. So if we can see here, some of the data is clearly sensitive. Like Sameer does not want all the developers and data scientists working on the Hadoop cluster to have access to the sensitive data. And the rest of the data can be divided into two different buckets. Like the product management team need not have access to the logistics data, and the logistics team need not have access to the product management data, right? And Sameer, being the director of IT or central IT, is responsible for managing this cluster and managing the data that comes with the cluster. So the thing that keeps him awake at night is the concern of how is he going to govern and protect this data. And we'll see how HT Insight's new features will bring a smile to Sameer's face. So just before I jump into the demos, I want to introduce just 5 different personas or people working on the cluster. Cluster admin is the one who is managing the cluster and is responsible for HT Insight cluster. And let's say there are 2 products or projects working on the cluster, the product demand analysis and the delivery and operations. The developer 1, data scientist 1, they work on project 1, and developer 2, data scientist 2, they work on project 2. So very straightforward, but not realistic. So what are these new features which I'm talking about, keep talking about, that we are adding to HT Insight, right? The first one is perimeter level security. And in perimeter level security, you can configure your HT Insight cluster in such a way that you set up only these IP addresses can communicate to your cluster. So no other IP address will be able to even make requests to your cluster, and you're just covered from the perimeter. The second one is multi-user authentication. Now, in the demo which we saw just few minutes ago, I logged into the HT Insight cluster using the admin credentials, right? And those admin credentials, I had supplied it when I created the cluster. Now let's take the Sameer's example again. If he really wants to support project 1 and project 2 on the HT Insight cluster, and he really wants to support the developers and the data scientists, what will he need to do so that they can run their jobs? He will have to share the admin ID and the user ID and the password with all those users. Now, how secure will be that? Right? It will be a nightmare for Sameer to figure out which user did what. So in the new functionalities, we are adding capabilities in HT Insight such that HT Insight will integrate with your Azure Active Directory. All the users from your Active Directory will be able to log on to the cluster using their own domain credentials. And there is no more need to create even more users or user accounts. The third one which we are adding is multi-user authorization. Now, Sameer understands that we have multi-user authentication. But in reality, each user is different. Each user has a different level of responsibility, and there is clear separation of duty amongst users. So what Sameer really wants is to have multiple access levels for each user, and that's where authorization comes into picture. And we are leveraging Apache Ranger, which is an open source industry-wide standard for that. And the last one is data security, or encryption of data at rest. With data security, what I mean is that your data will be secured and protected even when you are not using it. So even if somebody manages to breach through your cluster, you will have peace of mind that your data is not compromised. And we will go over all of these in much more detail now. So perimeter security in HD Insight is achieved using virtual networks and firewall rules. You can create your HD Insight cluster within a virtual network today and set up network security groups or firewall rules where you allow only certain IP addresses to communicate with your cluster. The second layer of defense, which we are adding for perimeter security, is the gateway service. Now I want to bring your attention to this block diagram. This is a really simple block diagram for HD Insight, but most of my presentation is based off this diagram. In the diagram, the outer rectangle which we see is a virtual network, which I talked about, that you can set firewall rules and network security groups for the virtual network. The inner rectangle, or the dotted rectangle, is an HD Insight cluster, and it's made of 3 different components. The first one is the gateway service, or the gateway node, which acts as the first line of defense whenever a request comes into the cluster. So if a request comes into the cluster, gateway is the one who accepts it, validates it, and if everything is okay, then it will allow the request to move forward to the head nodes or the worker nodes. The head node are the ones where the Hive services, which I showed you before, are running, or the Hadoop services. So Hive Server 2, Ambari, Uzi, Tez, Pig, and all these services, they run on the head node. It's more like a name node in a Hadoop vanilla cluster. The worker node, on the other hand, is more like a data node. So if we see here, any request which comes into the cluster goes to the gateway first, and your head nodes and your worker nodes are protected. No one is able to log on to the worker node at all. So let's say, for an example, a data scientist in Sameer's team wants to run a Hive job to figure out how the business is doing. So the data scientist makes a request to the gateway service. The gateway accepts the request, validates it, it passes on to the head node, or Hive Server 2 on the head node. Hive Server 2 will then execute or schedule a job on the worker nodes. The worker node will then fetch the data from the 2 data stores, which is either WASB or ADLS, either or, and then it will process the job and return the results back to the user. And that was a very simple overview of how a job runs in the HD Insight cluster. Now I want to show a demo of how easy it is to create an HD Insight cluster within a virtual network and set up some firewall rules so that no one can communicate with your cluster. Come on. So going back to our cluster creation page over here, instead of quick create, I'll go to custom create and the advanced settings. In the advanced settings, there is a section here for virtual networks. And I can just specify a virtual network over here, and the subnet will be picked by default. And these are the only 2 steps that you need so that you can create your cluster within the virtual network. Now I won't create the cluster now, but I'll show you a cluster which I've already created. So these HDI security over here is a network security group that I've already created. In the network security group, I see all these IP addresses and the rules, and these are all the inbound rules. So what this means is allow the request to this cluster from these inbound rules and these IP addresses only. Now I want to remind you that when I said what is HD Insight, it is a managed Hadoop and Spark offering. And what does managed really mean, right? So managed means that it is managed by Microsoft. And Microsoft will make sure that your cluster is always up and running and healthy so that you can run your jobs whenever you want. And to do that, we have probes, health probes running on these IP addresses. So these health probes will make sure that your cluster will continuously ping your cluster and make sure that it's up and running. And if something is wrong, some of the engineer from Microsoft or my team will wake up even in the middle of the night to go and fix that. So when you create a cluster, we require that you specify these IP addresses for our health probes. If you see clearly over here, there is no other IP address that I'm allowing to communicate with the cluster. And I've created a virtual network here. And this virtual network, Ignite Demo v10, in this virtual network, I have specified the network security groups or the firewall rules of HDI security here. And I've created this Ignite Demo v10 within the virtual network. So any guesses of what will happen if I click on the cluster dashboard? When I click on the dashboard, nothing will happen, because my IP address of this machine is not authorized to even send a request to the cluster, and the request will just fail. Taking you back to the IP address rules or the network security rules, there is one rule which I added here, which is allow SSH from any node on port 22, or any IP address on port 22. Now, I would never recommend yet that you go ahead and do that, but I added it just for the purposes of this demo, so that I can SSH from my node and show you that I can communicate with the cluster. So here is a tool which I use for SSH, Ignite Demo v10, and when I log on to the cluster, I will be able, and here I'm immediately logged on to the cluster node using SSH. So what this is saying is, even though I was not able to communicate with the cluster dashboard using port 80 or port 443, I can still use SSH because there was a different IP address rule for that one. Okay. So perimeter security is really great as an outer shell covering for HD Insight. But the real core and the meat comes from the 3 A's of security, which is authentication, authorization, and auditing. As I said before, authentication in HD Insight is being enabled now using Azure Active Directory. We will communicate or create your cluster and integrate it with Azure Active Directory using a new technology called Azure Active Directory Domain Services, or ADDS. There was a talk on ADDS just yesterday morning. I'm not sure if you guys had a chance to look at that. But what this means is all the Linux nodes of your cluster will be domain joined to your Active Directory. And what that means is all your Active Directory users will be able to log on to the cluster nodes using their own domain credentials. For authorization, as I said before, we are adding Apache Ranger. For those of you who don't know what Apache Ranger is, it is an industry standard framework used for managing and enabling and monitoring authorization for Hadoop clusters. There is a ton of work done in the open source system to add Apache Ranger. And I'm proud to say that HD Insight is the only cloud service which supports Ranger just out of the box. There is no other cloud service which supports this. So going back to the architecture diagram again, I want to show that there are two data scientists making a request to the cluster. This is just a way of symbolizing that multiple users can use the cluster at the same time. We are adding two new components now, which is Azure Active Directory or AAD tenant and Azure Active Directory Domain Services or ADDS. Now, let's imagine that you have the AAD setup and ADDS setup inside a VNet. You can now create your HD Insight inside a new virtual network, and you can pair these two different VNets using Azure VNet to VNet peering. VNet to VNet peering is also a new feature which is added to Azure, and there was a talk about this on Wednesday. Now let's say a data scientist logs on to the cluster again to run some jobs. Let's say, for example, again, Hive job. The difference now is though the data scientist does not use the admin credentials, but uses his own domain credentials. Gateway node is now Kerberized. It understands Kerberos. So gateway will communicate with ADDS and get the Kerb ticket for this user. Gateway will then pass the Kerb ticket to the head nodes or the services running on head node, let's say Hive Server 2. And Hive Server 2 will now wait before it will execute a job on the worker nodes. It will communicate with Apache Ranger first. It will make sure, Ranger will make sure that authorization policies exist for this user in the Ranger database. And when Ranger is completely satisfied that the user is authorized to run the query, it will let the head node know. The head node will go ahead and execute the job on the worker node. The worker node will fetch the data from either WASB or ADLS and return the data back to the server, to the data scientist. And if you are aware of what ADLS is, ADLS uses an OAuth token and not a Kerberos token. And in HD Insight, we have added functionalities so that we can convert the Kerberos token to an OAuth token, so user experience is just seamless. User does not have to log on here and log on there and do everything. The other thing which ADLS supports is file and folder level ACLs. So what this means is, as an admin, you can go and say in ADLS, give this user permission only to these files, or give the developer one permission only to the project one's folder and nothing else. And HD Insight will just seamlessly work with those ACLs when the job is run. WASB, on the other hand, does not natively support file and folder level ACLs. So whoever has access to the WASB keys has access to the whole kingdom or the whole database or data store. So we realize that this is a security hole, and security is not complete without this. So in HD Insight, we are going to add a Ranger plugin for WASB. And using the Ranger plugin, you will be able to go configure the plugin and set file and folder level ACLs for all the files in WASB, and you will get file and folder level authorization as well. Okay. So I want to show a demo now of all these things of authentication, authorization, auditing, which we have. So going back to our create screen again, over here you see a thing called domain joined HD Insight, which is optional. And let me click yes. When I click yes, I'm allowed to enter the domain settings. And these are the only domain settings that we need from your Active Directory so that we can communicate or integrate the HD Insight cluster with the Active Directory. let's see what these are, right? This is, the first one is just your domain name. So what do we need is ignitedemo.ad.onmicrosoft.com. Actually, let me show you the AD first. So this is the Azure Active Directory that I created for the purposes of this demo. As you can see, there are 4 groups in the Azure Active Directory. The first one is the admin group. The second one is the user group 1, user group 2, and user group 4. When I click the user group 1, there are the 4 people whom we are interested in. The data developer 1, developer 2, data scientist 1, and data scientist 2. And we want these users to have access to the Hadoop cluster or the HT Insight cluster. Okay. I have configured ADDS or Azure Active Directory domain services on this AD, and that's in this section over here. That's the IP address for the DNS server, and that's the external IP address for the LDAP-S access. And there's a certificate I configured it as well so that it's secure LDAP-S. Now let's go back to the cluster creation page. So in the cluster creation page, then I specify what is the domain name, and then I'll specify a domain user, which I want to be an admin on the Hadoop cluster. Now some people get confused here. Like one of my private preview customers, they came and they said like, oh, I'm not a domain admin, how can I go and create this cluster? And we were saying, no, you don't need to be a domain admin. You can just be a regular domain user to go ahead and create this cluster. All you need is just 2 privileges, that's all. The first privilege is you need privileges to be able to join machines to the domain, which I think most of us have. And the second thing is you need privileges to create service principals in the Active Directory, which also most users in Active Directory have. And these are just 2 privileges that you need. Then the domain password for that user, the organizational unit in the Active Directory. Now OU is more like a container, and within that container you go ahead and place the machines or service principals. And we just require this because we don't want to go ahead and pollute your Active Directory. So what we can do is we just place all these machines and service principals and go ahead and place this in the OU. The LDAP-S URL is just a URL to communicate with your Azure Active Directory or Active Directory. And finally, the access role group or the user access group. Now consider the case for Microsoft. It has about 100,000 employees. Right? It does not take a degree in rocket science to realize that we don't need all these 100,000 employees working on the Hadoop cluster at the same time. So what we have given here is a real power to the administrator that specify a security group, which is and all the users in that security group will have access to the cluster. No other user will be able to log on to the cluster at all. So when I created the cluster, I specified the user group 1 and the user group 2, these 2 user groups. So those user groups will be synced to the cluster, and the user group 4, which has developer 4, will not be synced. Now let me show you a cluster which I've already created called demo 5, and the overview page looks very much similar to the previous one. The cluster dashboard, and when I click the cluster dashboard, I'm again have a login screen. But the difference here is now I will not log in using the admin credential or the single user admin credentials, but instead I log in using the domain credentials which I use to create the cluster. So cluster admin at ignitedemo.ad.onmicrosoft.com. And when you log in, you will see that the experience is exactly the same. I still see all the Hadoop services running on the cluster. I am still an admin. I have an option to add services, restart, or stop the services. I still see all the monitoring tools and the widgets. But there is a difference. Now there is a Kerberos button here. And when I click on Kerberos, it says Kerberos security is enabled. Can you guys see this, or should I zoom in? So Kerberos security is now enabled. And HD Insight has gone ahead and added all the Kerberos configuration for this cluster. As an admin, I can still go to the Hive views, and I can still query or run the Hive jobs on this cluster. Right? So when on this cluster, I've already created 2 databases for our demo, the Project 1 database and the Project 2 database. And what I want as an admin to configure so that the developer 1 and developer 2 have access to Project 1, or developer 1 and data scientist 1 have access to Project 1, and dev 2 and data scientist 2 have access to Project 2. So I want to show in the Project 1, there is a customer database or table, and I can go ahead and run some queries against the customer table. They will return very quickly. But if I see here, there are few columns in the customer table: the name, credit card, address, email. All of these are sensitive data. And I don't really want the developers and the data scientists to have access to this sensitive data. So what I'm going to do here is have authorization. So here is the sensitive data which I was talking about: the customer name, credit card, email, address, and others. So what I can do now is launch Ranger and show how I can create authorization policies. Okay. But actually, before that, now you may ask that this is all great. The admin was able to log on using the domain credentials. Admin was able to go and run some Hive queries. But what about those developers and data scientists? What is the view that they see? And that comes from this Manage Ambari page. So when I go on the Manage Ambari, on the left bottom, I see a Manage Users plus Groups page. When I click on the users, you will see that all those users, the data scientists 1, 2, 3, and the developers 1, 2, 3 are now synced to the cluster. If you see the type of the users, they are LDAP users and not local users, which means they are coming from the Active Directory. So what would happen if a developer now logs on using his domain credentials on the cluster? Let's go ahead and log in a private window on the cluster using the using the developer credentials. So developer 1 at ignitemoad.onmicrosoft.com. And when it logs in, you will see that nothing. The developer has access to nothing. This is really important to understand that even though the developers and all those users were synced to the cluster, the admin has to explicitly go and add permissions or give permissions for any user to do anything or run any jobs. So let's close this and go to the admin view again. On the Managing the Dashboard, there is a section called Views. So I can go to Views, I can go to Hive View, and configure the Hive View. Now we have already configured the view a lot over here, but on the bottom you see a section called Permissions. And it says grant permission to these users. So on this page, I can go ahead and say grant permission to the developer 1 or data scientist 1. Or in fact, even better, I can just go ahead and say, give permissions to the user group 1 and user group 2. And this is all I need to do when the to give permissions so that those users can log on to the cluster and run jobs using the Hive views. There is one more thing which I want to point your attention to, and that's roles. So as an admin, you can give specific roles to your cluster, to your users. You can give cluster administrator, operator, or service operator, or cluster user roles. By default, we recommend that you give only the cluster user roles to your developers. And here as well, I can give user groups as well, or just developer one. Now let's go ahead and log on as a developer and see now what the experience is. So again, going to the cluster and logging as a developer one. And when it logs in, you will see that now the developer has access to Hive views. And not only that, the developer now also sees the services which are running on the cluster. But he will not be able to restart or reboot or any services. There are no admin access for the services. There is no manage Ambari page as well. That's available only to admins, right? So this is very important because, and now the developer can go ahead and monitor the cluster as well. And this is really important because, say the developer is writing some complex scripts like Hive scripts, he wants to see what is the impact of his scripts on the cluster. How is the cluster behaving? How are the resources of the cluster when the scripts are run? So developer again can go to the views now. He can go to Hive views, and you will see that he has access to the default database. Now wait a minute here. We wanted to give the developers access to project one and not the default database. And we wanted him to run queries on the project one or the customer one table. So what the admin can do is now launch Apache Ranger and explicitly go ahead and give permissions to the developers. So the Apache Ranger endpoint is just your cluster URL /Ranger. As I mentioned before, Apache Ranger is an industry standard framework for managing and enabling authorization. Ranger plugins are available in the industry for Hive, HBase, Storm, Kafka, and many things. And I also mentioned that we are adding a new plugin for WASP. So on this cluster, I've installed a Hive Ranger plugin. When I go to the Hive plugin, I see that some policies have been created by default, the first 3 policies. The last policy is the one which I added for project 2. Let's go ahead and see those policies. So when I log in, or when I see the policy project 2, there are few things here to look at or consider. The first one is the Hive database. So what this policy is saying that give access for project 2 database. All the tables, all the columns within the database, and give access only to developer 2 and data scientist 2. And what permissions? Give only the select permissions. So you can go ahead and give, update, create, drop, alter, or whatever permissions you want. The other thing to consider here is the audit logging. So audit logging, I have set it as yes, which means that any action taken by these 2 users on the project 2 will be logged. Each and every action will be tracked. Okay. So now let's go and create a new policy for the project 1. And this is where we want the developer to go ahead and access the database. So I will set the database as project 1, the tables as say star, the columns as let's say just star, and developer 1 and data scientist 1. Let's go ahead and give only the select permissions and nothing. And when I click add, now a policy will be created and developers will now have access to the project 1 database. But if you remember, project 1 had a table called customer. And within the customer table, there were some columns which had sensitive information. Now, when I give these permissions to the developer, they will have access to those columns and also the values within the columns. So there are two choices for admin. The first what he can do is he can go to exclude, and instead of star, he can explicitly say exclude access to the name column, address, credit card, or address, email address. But there is an even better way to do that, and let me show you that. So let's go ahead and create this policy first. I can go to something, a new feature called masking. And masking means that those users will have access to those columns, but the data will all be garbled. It will be masked. And this is really important because sometimes there is a business justification that I really need access to this column, and if those columns are not even available, then the developers or data scientists will not be able to write the queries. So I've already created some 4 policies here for masking. Let me show you the policies. So the first policy is customer name. The database is project 1. The table is customer. And the column is name. Again, audit logging I've set to yes. This policy is applicable for developer 1 and data scientist 1. The access type is select, and there are a lot of masking options. In the first masking option, there are some masking options where it says show the last 4, which is really nice for credit cards or social security numbers. And over here, I'm just using hash or nullify. I mean, these are just very simple options. So when I create these policies, all the developers will have access to these data, but the values will be masked. For credit card, instead, what I did is I just set the select group as public. So everyone will, it applies to everyone, and I set the option as nullify. So now let's go ahead and log on to the developer again screen. And now we see that the project 1 database shows up over here on the left-hand side. Previously, we saw only the default database. When I click on project database, there are still 3 tables which I have access to. I still have access to all the customer table, and I can still see all the columns. But when I run the query and the query returns, you will see that the results of the query will have all those columns, but the values will all be masked. So the query returned, and now the customer name is all hashed out. The credit card is null. The customer email is all hashed out. So all this information I still have access to, but I don't see the values. Okay. And let me tell you, all the masking, this all happens on the fly itself. And it does not happen on the fly for this client, just the Hive client. It happens on the fly on the Hadoop cluster itself. So even if I use a different tool, say Excel, for example, oh, this font is too small. Let me just zoom it. So I'm using Excel, and I have an ODBC connection on Excel to the demo 5 cluster, Hadoop cluster, on Hive connection for a Hive. For the default database on Hive, or the project 1 database on Hive, and the customer table, I can still query all the results, but the results are still masked. So even if I use Excel or Tableau or Power BI or even Visual Studio tools, I will still be able, as a developer, if I run the queries, I'll still be able to access all the tables, but not the values. So going back to our admin mode over here. Actually, this is the developer mode. So going back to our admin mode over here. Now I see a button called Audit. When I click on Audit, I'm able to see each and every transaction taken on this cluster by any users and what happened with those transactions. I can still see which IP it generated from, and I can still see all the queries which were run on the cluster. Now what would happen if, let's say for example, a developer 2 logs onto the cluster and runs some queries. So I'm logging on the cluster using developer 2's domain credentials. Similarly, I'll still see all the Hive views. And when I go to Hive views, you will notice that I have access only to the default and the project 2 because of the Ranger policies. I'm the developer 2. Now let's say I still want to use project 1. And let's say I still want to get data from customer. And when I execute this, you will realize that the query will fail because the developer 2 does not have access to the project 1. And there is the failure, permission denied. Developer 2 does not have privileges on project 1. But not only that, when I go to the admin view and when I go to audit, I will immediately see that the developer 2 tried to query some data against project 1, which was denied. Now this is really powerful to track what happens and which users are doing what, right? So there was a private preview customer who said to me that I allowed a user group 1 to create when the cluster was created and the users from that user were synced. But now what if I want to add some new users? And I said, just add them to that security group and we will continuously keep syncing those users from the security group. And he said, no, I really want to create a new security group. And I want those users from the new security group to be synced. And that's the new security group over here, which is, say, user 4. User group 4. So for that, we have an APIs. So you can now go to, let me show you this, zoom it a little bit. So you can go to the demo 5 or the URL API and do an LDAP sync. This is the body for API, and I'm syncing, say, user group 4. In the authorization, I'm adding my cluster admin credentials, and I hit send. And within just a second, those users will be synced from the Active Directory to the cluster. So if I go to Ambari, and if I go to Manage Ambari in Users, I will now see that the developer 4, which is from user group 4, has been synced to the cluster. And in the groups, user group 4 has been synced to the cluster. Okay. Yeah.
Is that a manual step you had to do?
That's a manual step only if you want some new extra users in some new extra security groups to be added to the cluster. On the cluster creation time, you can specify whatever security groups you wanted to add. So for example, actually, let me go to the roles. There was a private preview customer who said, we are creating a new security group called on-call engineers. And on-call is a term which most of the service companies have. And these engineers wake up even in the middle of the night to go ahead and fix the cluster. Now they had some services which are running on the cluster, and if something went wrong, they had to call the admin to go ahead and reboot the services. So what they did is that they gave a user group 4 here on the cluster operator role. And with what this means is when now the developer 4 logs onto the cluster using the cluster operator, he is the cluster operator, so he will be able to have some explicit permissions like I can reboot the services or I can restart the services. And that's only during his on-call turn. So it's a really cool feature that if you want some extra user security groups to be added to the cluster, you can still go ahead and add them. Okay. So we saw a lot of demos. We saw how you can create an HD Insight cluster. You can integrate it with your Active Directory. We saw how you can sync multiple users to Ambari and manage those multiple users on Ambari. And we also saw that how you can give the users explicit permissions to Hive views so that they can go ahead and run the queries. And then we saw how you can use Apache Ranger to add authorization policies for those users and do auditing on Apache Ranger. Now, in the open source system, new components are being added all the time. And we keep adding them in HD Insight as well. But some of these components, they are not secure. Somebody has not thought through the complete security process for these. So for example, WebHCat, which was previously called Templeton, it has no Ranger policies. It does not even respect Ranger policies. It just bypasses Ranger policies and goes ahead. So we realized that. And what we did in HD Insight is we went ahead and we tied up all those loose endpoints, and we said only the cluster administrator will have access to those. And all the secure endpoints which we have, all the users will have access to the secure endpoints like Hive or Ambari views and Ranger and others. The last pillar of security is encryption of data at rest. Now, as I mentioned before, HD Insight works with 2 different types of data stores: Windows Azure Storage or WASB and Azure Data Lake Storage or ADLS. Both these data stores support transparent server-side encryption at rest. And HD Insight seamlessly works with both these data stores. So what I mean with transparent server-side encryption is that all your reads and writes will be transparently encrypted and decrypted, and data will be stored in an encrypted fashion. You don't have to take any explicit action other than configuring encryption, of course. But when you don't have to take any explicit action when you do the reads and the writes. And HD Insight will just seamlessly work with both of these data stores. The Azure Data Lake Storage, which I talked about, is in public preview right now. And the Windows Azure Storage WASB has general availability was just a week back or 2 weeks back. There was a talk of this encryption at rest on WASB just yesterday afternoon. The keys for this encryption, they are managed, for WASB, they are managed by Microsoft. And for ADLS, you have an option to manage your own keys as well, where you would store the keys in Azure Key Vault or someplace. This is just a screenshot of how easy it is to create a storage account and enable encryption on that one. Now we went over a lot of things. We saw AAD integration, multi-user Ambari, Ranger, and some Excel tooling and Power BI. So all this will be available in public preview in just the next few weeks. And on our roadmap, we have Ranger for Spark, we have Ranger for HBase, and Kafka and Storm, which will be coming in the next few months, by the end of this year, hopefully. So just to recap, we saw a brief overview of what HD Insight is. We saw how easy it is to create an HD Insight cluster. And then we saw how you can have perimeter security using virtual networks and firewall rules. We saw how you can create an HD Insight cluster using Azure Active Directory and configure multi-user authorization, authentication, and auditing using Ranger. And lastly, we saw encryption of data at rest with HD Insight. And I hope I send you back with just one key takeaway, that HD Insight is the solution that you would need if you want enterprise-grade capabilities for Hadoop on cloud. Thank you, and have a good day. And just a reminder, your feedback is very important to us. We take this very, very seriously. So if you can take some moment and go ahead and give feedback, that would be nice.
So when is Ranger going to be available then?
In just the next few weeks.
In public preview, right?
In public preview, yeah.
Any thoughts on GA? When is that?
GA, I don't have the exact dates, but roughly it will be Q1 of next year. Yeah. Okay. If you have any questions, I'll be hanging around just here.